Dr. Turrell, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with an extremely basic question that is ultimately about this big news. First and foremost, for those who don't know what is nuclear fusion? And how does it differ from nuclear fission? How does it differ from when people think about a nuclear reactor? What is the difference?
So nuclear fusion is the process that powers the stars, literally star power. So you'll have been enjoying it yourself. Each day you go outside and feel the sun's rays fall on your face. So there's nothing mysterious about this. It occurs in nature all the time. And the way it works is by taking smaller atoms and combining them to make bigger atoms. And this is where the distinction with nuclear fission is. Because in nuclear fission, you take big atoms and you split them apart. Now, in both cases, fusion and fission for energy, you end up with a bit less mass at the end than what you put in. So in fusion, you've got these light atoms, you stick them together, their nuclei kind of glue together. But the end nucleus that you get resulting over from the fusion has a bit less mass in. And that difference in mass between what you put in and what you got out is released as energy, just as Einstein's famous equation E equals mc squared says.
What makes nuclear fusion technology so important that scientists have been researching it and developing it for decades? Why is this such a big revelation today?
So I think on a scientific level, people are excited about it because it's one of the greatest technological challenges humanity has ever taken on. Because fusion requires such extreme conditions, to do it on Earth requires temperatures that are 10 times hotter than the core of the sun, pressures 300 billion times what you'd find on Earth. While fusion is so common in the universe, it was there at the start of the universe, it's what lights up the universe, so it's really kind of prevalent, so it feels important from a scientific point of view. But I think much bigger is the potential social impacts, because fusion as an energy source has lots of potential advantages. The first and foremost being that it's potentially a carbon-free energy source. It's cleaner in other senses as well, so there's no chance of meltdown. It doesn't produce long-lived radioactive waste. And scientists think there's probably enough supply of the fuel for it for thousands, if not millions of years of energy for everyone on the planet.
Would it be safe to say that nuclear fusion is kind of the holy grail of modern physics research? The one thing that if science could get, it could just change the entire world?
It's very tempting to say that, and people have sometimes called it that. I mean, I think I'm a bit more of a realist on this. So I think what we need is a portfolio of different energy sources that have different pros and cons. And, fusion is another energy source. It's got some amazing pros. I think it will have some cons as well. So one thing is that, from what we can tell today, it probably needs relatively large plants. And even though it can produce a lot of energy per amount of land use compared to, say, renewables, the capital costs of setting up a fusion plant are quite large before you actually get, or are likely to be quite large before you get any energy out. Now, having said that, if I think about, humanity in the future, where are we going to get most of our energy from? I think there's a very good chance that it's going to be from nuclear fusion. And let me tell you, if we're thinking about our far future and exploring beyond the solar system, if we're going to do that at all in any serious way, it's going to be nuclear fusion. It's the only energy source that can take us to the stars, literally.
Now, according to the announcement made on Tuesday by the U.S. Department of Energy, scientists at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California, they successfully, as you alluded to, produced a nuclear fusion reaction resulting in a net energy gain. That's the key. I'm old enough to remember, I think it was in the 80s, there was this moment of excitement around so-called cold fusion, where they thought they had cracked the nut, and then it turned out that they actually hadn't cracked that nut. So I guess my question on this is, how does what we've learned this week differ from other nuclear fusion tests that have taken place in the past? Is this going to be one of those things that we look back on? Is there any chance that it's going to be one of those things we look back on and say, actually, the results may have seemed like a big deal in the moment, but actually they weren't that big a deal, kind of like the cold fusion situation many years ago?
Yeah, the history of fusion is littered with false dawns where either, the scientists were very earnest and just made a mistake, or there was, outright fraudulent claims. I think there are a few reasons why this time people should be excited and why I believe they really have smashed this long-standing goal of producing more energy than they put in. The first is that Lawrence Livermore has the world's best experts on this type of fusion, laser fusion, and they've been doing it for a really long time. Almost as soon as the laser came out, there was a memo written at Lawrence Livermore saying, "Hey, we could use this for fusion." They're also experts on nuclear technologies. As you probably know, it's where the stockpile stewardship for the United States nuclear arsenal is as well, with the stockpile stewardship program. So they're really, they know what they're talking about when it comes to nuclear things. The other factor is that if you look at the progress over time since the National Ignition Facility at Livermore opened, I think it opened in 2009, 2010 sort of time, they've been making this gradual progress all the time. And back in August last year, they actually got to about 70% of net energy gain. So almost as much energy out as they put in. And, a couple of years before that, they hit 3%. And over time, you can just see it going up. And they've been very, very transparent about the results, about the process. And the most important thing is there's a particle that comes out of these reactions called a neutron, and they can show that they can measure, the numbers of neutrons that you just couldn't get unless you were doing this for real. So this time, everyone is convinced that they've done it.
One other question that comes up, it may be kind of a technical question, but they discovered this in the middle of the night on December 5th, only a few weeks ago. What was the barrier, the obstacle that they broke through to now be able to get more energy out of the system than they had put in, this big breakthrough? In other words, what was the one thing that they hadn't yet cracked that they now have cracked?
Oh, that depends how you see it. So there's one version of this story that kind of says, there's been lots of scientific progress here that's enabled them to do this, and it's kind of built up over time. And there's another one that says, if they'd have got the funding to build a laser that was 50% bigger on day one, then we would never have had this long wait. They could have done this in 2010.
Where do you come down on that?
Yeah, so I think both are true, actually. If they had got a laser that was 50% bigger or maybe even 100% bigger, then I think they could have done this some time ago. And, my PhD supervisor, Professor Steve Rose, has always said, if they had a bigger hammer, they'd probably be able to do it. And it's notable that in this experiment, they did significantly up the laser energy. Now, that being said, some of the scientific breakthroughs they've made or had to invent, create new patents for to get to this point with the laser energy that they have are absolutely astonishing. And even if we never use fusion for energy, everyone on the program deserves just a massive round of applause for the science they've done. Just to give you an idea of how extreme this is, a 0.1% error in the energy at the start of the laser pulse can degrade the conditions needed for fusion by as much as 50%. So they're working within incredible tolerances to make this happen. And literally, they have invented new technology to get to this point. Now, it's really great that this has happened, and I can see that in future, maybe bigger lasers are going to be the way that this is repeated elsewhere.
Let's talk about bringing this to scale. There's a lot of discussion about the fact that even with this breakthrough, that it's still decades away to bring this to scale as a mass source of energy across the planet. Is that true? And what needs to happen to bring fusion energy to scale in a way that it could actually be a big part of combating the climate crisis and the use of fossil fuels?
It's absolutely true that there's a long road between this scientific demonstration of feasibility and something that looks like a commercial power plant. And, it's really worth saying that if some scientists had come to you and said, hey, we want to build a power plant based on a technology we don't even know works, you'd have probably said no. You probably told them where to get off, to be honest. So it was really important that this is a milestone, but this facility, the funding was only to demonstrate scientific feasibility, and that's what they've done. So let's turn now to the next chapter. Let's say that they get the funding to take this idea further. There are some really, really big engineering and economics challenges. So we're kind of moving away a little bit from the science here, and it becomes about engineering. And the first is that, this was a single shot on a single experiment. To make this commercially viable, it needs to happen probably 10 times a second. And that means a very different type of laser technology. That laser technology is out there, but it's not quite ready yet. We also saw on this experiment, again, a 50%, so 1.5 times the energy out that was put in. Now, for commercial viability, you need much, much higher energy than that to overcome the energy of keeping the lights on and the computers on and charging up the capacitor banks and all of this extra stuff that goes on. And for that, you're probably looking at getting a gain of 30 times rather than 1.5 times. Now, the great thing about fusion is it scales non-linearly. So going from 1.5 to 2 to 5 to 10 is probably actually a lot easier than going from 0.1 to 1. So, there's reasons to be optimistic. But even if we solve both of those things, there's also the questions of how do we get the heat out? How do we use it to turn water into steam to power a turbine? And how do we get it on the grid?
I should ask, because there are real fears about current nuclear reactors and the safety of them, especially in the wake, for instance, of Fukushima a number of years ago. What are the dangers, if any, associated with nuclear fusion technology at scale? Would a fusion nuclear plant run the risk of a meltdown or something similar?
It's a great question, but I should preface it by saying that actually, if you look at the data, fission is one of the safest forms of energy generation out there. Now, that's not to say it doesn't have problems. And of course, having an image problem is a problem in itself for people. And there are lots of reasons why people feel uncomfortable about fission, which we should take really seriously. So the great thing about nuclear fusion and why scientists are so excited about it is because there is just no chance of meltdown. Meltdown happens because things get out of control. In a fusion experiment, the second that you remove the right conditions, the whole thing just stops. It's hard to start fusion and it's really easy to stop it. And that's one of the reasons why it's been so much more difficult than nuclear fission. The other factor is that you don't get long-lived radioactive waste. So we expect that a fusion reactor will still produce some radioactive waste just from the activation of the chamber that the targets sit in, but not actually the fuel itself doesn't become radioactive. So that's less of a worry. And actually, this kind of level of radioactivity of the chamber will probably be safe in about 100 years instead of the thousands of years. And it's quite low level as well. So for all of those reasons, people think it's going to be a safer alternative to fission.
I guess there's also this question about government priorities, whether in the United States or across the world. And I want to preface this question by saying it doesn't have to be an either or choice when you're dealing with the level of resources that Europe or the United States have at their disposal. But there is this question of what the government should be prioritizing, a question of funding, a question of if this is a long way off, should governments around the world be making the funding of this research a priority over other technologies to deal with, for instance, the climate crisis and the carbon emissions from fossil fuels. So I guess my question is, like, how much, if you were advising members of Congress or presidents across the world, and they say, look, I want to be careful with the resources that we spend. There is at a certain level a finite amount of resources. How much of a priority, if they ask you, how much of a priority should research into fusion be, knowing that it's still decades off? What's your answer to that question?
So I think, ultimately this is a question for elected representatives, but you got in there that I'm advising them. So well done. Yeah. If I was advising them, I mean, speaking with my economics hat on, I'd probably say, sometimes the public sector is in a good place to provide things, sometimes the private sector is. So it becomes a question of what the kind of market failure is that means we need kind of government intervention. And I'd say for some of the renewables now, they're so cheap and accessible that actually there's a thriving private sector. Those things are ready to be deployed. You can go out, you can buy them. And I question whether some of them still need government support. In terms of getting off carbon, that's a classic example of a market failure. And economists love to talk about carbon taxes to kind of encourage us to move away from to encourage us to pay the true cost of those things, right? Which people aren't internalizing at the moment. And then in terms of fusion, there are several reasons why governments have seen fit to fund it. One of them is the fact that it's uncertain, and inherently, even though we now know fusion works in principle, because of this stunning moment of history that we've seen today, what we don't know is what the best and most economical way of doing fusion is, and there are alternative ways of doing it. So government can help remove that uncertainty by funding them, and government can also take a longer view sometimes. And is able to pay those upfront capital costs, which are really, really expensive for the first generations of a kind of unproven technology. Now, of course, at some point, there is going to be a place for the private sector taking on some of these things and getting it into homes. Maybe it's a partnership, maybe there's a kind of handover at some point. Both will be important, but right now, I think fusion probably needs more of that support than some other technologies.
I mean, that's the whole theory behind, for instance, basic scientific research and development into pharmaceuticals, that the idea is that the government, because the government isn't on such a profit-pressured schedule, that the government can provide research into longer horizoned products or innovations that the private sector can't do. Now, I should say there are always then questions about who ends up making the profits off of the finalized technology. And my guess is if fusion continues to advance, there will be those big questions about how it is deployed by the private sector. But as you said, we're not there yet. I just want to ask one last question then. Is there anything else about this breakthrough, this huge news this week, that you wanted to mention? Is there anything else that you're either super excited about or skeptical about as an expert in this?
So I think there's two things. The first thing I'd say is that there might not necessarily be that much new physics here, because they've been kind of on this journey for a while, making kind of tweaks and maybe just hit it with a bigger hammer, more laser input energy. But psychologically, the effect of being able to do this, to show that it can be done, is huge. And that's going to crowd in interest, investment, and further innovation. And I think there's a good chance here that we could get into a virtuous cycle of development where we've got a bit of gain, people want to invest, we get further gain. And, people always joke about fusion being 30 years away, but it really depends how much we want it and how much we're willing to back it. So that's an exciting thing. And we saw in the pandemic how unproven technologies that normally take 10 years to come to fruition can happen within a year, right? So it's there if we want it. That's one really important message. The other is just, even if we abandon fusion tomorrow, the science that researchers at Livermore and their partners around the world have put in to get to this point is absolutely phenomenal. Extremes that are unheard of in the rest of the solar system being recreated in the lab, precision control. The lasers are guided to within a micron, so a millionth of a meter to their target. And we've got things that are almost at absolute zero, right next to things that are 10 times hotter than the center of the sun. It's extraordinary. So check out the details.
We talk a lot on this show about things that are crises, that are sometimes depressing, sometimes a lot of times bad news. This, to my mind, I mean, I'm kind of a novice science geek, or at least I'm interested in it. I am like super psyched about this stuff. I think it's incredibly exciting. And I said on social media, I said, this may be treated in some ways in popular media as kind of just another passing science story. But I think there's a very good chance that it's not just some passing science story, that we could look back on this as one of the biggest news events of the last 100 years. And I just want to thank you, Dr. Arthur Turrell, for explaining it to us, to helping us understand what it means. Dr. Turrell is the author of the must-read book, The Star Builders, Nuclear Fusion and the Race to Power the Planet. You can find him on Twitter at Arthur Turrell. Dr. Turrell, thanks so much.
Thank you.